Good afternoon. My name is Everett Harper. On October 1st, 2013, healthcare.gov launched and promptly crashed. The story of how a group of engineers, including my company Truss, fixed it led me to think about how this could be a pattern and how it could be avoided. And in particular led me down the path of thinking about complex problems. I started to develop a framework that I call Infrastructuralism. There's a complicated version of that, but more simply, it's move to the edge and declare it center. A phrase used by Dave Hickey to describe how Andy Warhol went from someone who couldn't get a gig in New York City because it was dominated by abstract expressionists to being the darling of the 60s art world. Using these words, I was able to come up with this framework, and so I'll go through each one. Declare. Declare is about vision. What direction are you going in? Edge is about learning, and this is critical in complex systems because there are many moving parts that are all interacting together, and the results are often not predictable. Flow is bringing that information into the rest of the organization, campaign, or public agency in order to spread that information and make change. And finally, leverage. Deciding to place a bet, apply leverage, and if right, go to some scale. I'm going to tell a couple stories. And as I tell these stories, I want to engage you to think about whether these practices and tools are things you are already doing, because this really is built on existing and past practices, as we'll see in a second. I'm going to start the story in 1950s and 60s New York City, specifically Greenwich Village. Robert Moses was the epitome of post-war flexion in New York. Centrally, he was incredibly powerful city manager who basically decided what New York was going to look like. And one of those decisions was going to be building a road right through Greenwich Village, destroying Washington Square Park and Little Italy. Now, Robert Moses was incredibly powerful. He built the Triborough Bridge, the New York's Fair, as well as a bunch of other things. And he was the epitome of, we will decide, and the residents will have to go with it. That didn't sit well with one resident, Jane Jacobs. She had a different vision. She had a vision that was about cities as amazing organic places. And in Death and Life in American Cities, she poses this question that cities are organized complexity. So, with that in mind, she went with the vision and then went to the edge. The edge, from the city's perspective, was what the residents thought. So she went to her neighbors, built coalitions, got information. She still had to bring it and move that information where it could be decided. Public hearings were not common, or they were announced at the last minute. She forced her way in and shared that information in pretty forceful and persistent ways. Along the way, she learned there was a key thing that was going to make them successful: to prevent any buildings from being condemned. As long as that happened, the city couldn't raise the neighborhood. The tactic was using injunctions, and over the period of 10 years under fierce resistance, she wound up winning. Now, the thing I love about this is that this model is resilient and adaptable. Why? Well, the proof is neither of them could have anticipated urban infill, lift, millennials moving back into the city but not buying cars. She was the original infrastructuralist, moving to the edge, using local information, and bringing it to the center of power. This is important. Cities are complex, or organized complexity. And complexity, as defined by Samuel Arbesman, a complexity scientist, is things are complex when they have a huge number of diverse parts that interact in multifaceted ways. Biological cells, massive computing networks, It's different than complicated. Complicated, the best analogy is a plane. You can build a plane, it's got lots of parts, but you know how they're going to interact. It's imperative because we're living in an age of accelerating complexity, climate change, data privacy, and security, political campaigns. The problem is the way we manage that and the way we attempt to solve that often is embedded in 20th century management systems, waterfall development, central planning, rigid leadership philosophy, and frankly, it's a mismatch. Let me show you another example that demonstrates that mismatch. Going back to healthcare.gov. Now the vision was very clear. 1 million enrolled by December 24th, or the program would be yanked. This polyglot of engineers that came from many different places, none of whom were familiar necessarily with the systems, had to figure out what was going on. They decided to engage in a problem hierarchy, which Mikey Dickerson wrote up here. Now the interesting thing to notice is if you go from the bottom up, monitoring is simply trying to figure out what is going on. And they moved up the ladder by figuring out if we're dealing with a higher quality problem this week than we were last week, we're making progress and we move on up. You might also notice that the typical way of doing these projects is from the top down. Knowing they had a complex system and had to figure out and test the assumptions, they went bottom up and were able to figure out what was going on. One of the key pieces was how information was not moving into the center. In particular, engineers who might see problems had to get 4 or 5 different layers of approval to make even the simplest change. And that was put in by contract. You can imagine how frustrating that might be. They were able to reduce those layers and started to make real progress on the site. And finally, they moved that philosophy and they worked with existing engineers in a different way of looking at things, and they put the center not in the boardroom, but in the war room. There was a pit boss who had the authority to shut down the site at any time if they felt that there was an issue. And when you combine all these things, when my business partner Mark Falat got a call at 1:55 saying, the president is going, from the White House, going in on a press conference at 2 p.m. Is this site up? He was able to answer that question with nervousness, but with confidence. Putting this all together, you see that this team was able to take a situation that was complex, they didn't have a lot of information, and in an incredibly short period of time, figure out what to do. Not only that, there are now a group of people, both in the government at USDS and at 18F, and in private companies like Nava, Code for America, Nuna, Ad Hoc, and ourselves at Trust, that are trying to tackle this problem because last I heard, the government is a really complex place to operate when it's trying to serve its citizens. And an emerging tack is to think about procurement and budgeting, which I hope to have a good discussion with you at a different time. So we've seen a complex problem being solved in 2 different ways. Now, there's a core element of this which is embodied by my only Hamilton reference. Believe me, I had to edit them down. It's about trying to see with new eyes. And it's not technology, further technology, that's going to solve it. It's being able to see outside of ourselves and take a different mindset. And that mindset is brilliantly exemplified by John DeGioia. John DeGioia is the Chancellor of Georgetown, and he was tasked with building the 21st century university. Universities are pretty complex, and interactions with education itself is highly complex. Not only that, he was trying to do this with a 200-year academic tradition and a 2,000-year religious tradition. His response was really interesting, declaring, I know what the vision is, but I don't know the answer. We're going to do lots of experiences, and some of them will fail. When they fail, I'm not going to shoot the messenger. I'm going to say, oops, will you follow me anyway? This is a mindset and it's a practice. And I think it is one of the best descriptions of what a leader of an organization trying to understand complex systems and solve complex problems has to embody. We've seen how Jane Jacobs went to the edge, and there are practices that you probably already do. Having diverse populations, not only within the team, but getting information from customers, partners, outside information protects you from making egregious mistakes like the AI bot from Microsoft that started out as a 16-year-old, was intended to be a 16-year-old girl, and wound up being trained to be a white supremacist. There are numerous examples from the campaign where polls and expectations on both Republican and Democratic side led to realizing that the models that they had were incorrect in a systematic way. Diversity in this case is not just about demographics, it's about attitudes, language, access, history, stories, mental models, and metaphors, particularly the mental models. Having a diverse set of mental models can help us think outside of ourselves. Having a testing culture, getting out of the office and building those coalitions help round that out and create the most opportunity for learning. Moving, which is moving that information into the organization or the coalition, is about reducing friction. Friction to collaborate, to communicate, to shipping. You can do things like automating your work such that the work itself trivially reports to everyone. So less meetings, less phone calls, less video calls. Making the work visible enables people from other departments to see it. Doing retrospectives, which I will have resources available after this talk, is a great way to surface information that other departments can't get to. And finally, having a mix of generalists and specialists, and the generalists, importantly, have the ability to learn outside their area of expertise. Combining those make for the ability to move information within a system, within a company, or within an organization. When you put those together, those are your operations. We've already seen how John DeGioia is my inspiration for in his work with Georgetown. And Samuel Arbesman has a great quote about the attitude and mindset that's needed to respond to complex problems and systems. It's humility without reverence. He was humble enough to say that I don't know the answer, but without revering the enormous task he had at hand. The second part of the quote is curiosity without fear. To be interested in both the good experiments and the failed experiments without being scared of not being able to make progress. There's a whole body of neuroscience, social psychology that supports these attitudes as a component of high performance. In particular, these studies are done with people who are high level of meditation, extreme sports, and elite athletes. You can cultivate these attitudes within yourself and within your team. And finally, the center, being able to apply leverage and scale. These attitudes you saw being trained in the war room, taking engineers who may not have had experience with agile methodologies and enabling them and encouraging them to say, hey, you can solve problems. We just need fast feedback. And then focus those resources where it's needed. The other thing to say is you might have to kill some of your darlings. You may have a pet hypothesis, a deep belief that in a complex system acts differently than you might have expected. And that takes some courage. And that when you put those two pieces together, it's what I call the leadership component of this framework. We live in an age of accelerating complexity. We need to recognize the problem we have and avoid the mismatch of a centralized planning system when we have a complex set of situations and issues. If we are able to do that with courage, We can say I don't know the answer, but still be able to make the match and still be able to do things and build things that are amazing. In fact, we can pursue mastery. If I was to put this framework in a mastery terms, seeking the ability to tinker at the edge, to declare your vision with humility, to move almost in flow state within the organization, and then to apply leverage with curiosity. So I've talked about a variety of things, and I hope that some of the practices and tools are somewhat familiar to you. And I hope that we engage in this because I want to move to the edge and I want to learn as well. So that's the invitation. Please have comments, have suggestions. Here's the challenge. Whether we live in an era where climate change, big data, politics, or artificial intelligence all are complex and accelerating. We can't afford to have this central planning mental model. The future of work is a future that we cannot yet envision. So, if you want to dent the future, move to your edge with curiosity and humility and declare that your center. Thank you, and hope to hear from you.